The golden sunset bled across the Montana horizon as Grace Albright clutched the telegram that would forever change her life. Her father had promised her hand to a wealthy stranger without her knowledge or consent, and the wedding was scheduled in just 7 days. It was the spring of 1885 in the small town of Timber Creek, Montana Territory. Grace stood on the porch of her family's modest ranch house, the paper trembling in her hands as she reread the words. Her father, Jeremiah Albright, had been away in Helena for 3 months on business, and this telegram was the first she'd heard from him in weeks. Arranged advantageous marriage for you. Arriving with groom Mr. Holton Wednesday. Wedding Sunday. Prepare accordingly. At 21 years old, Grace had long feared this day might come. Her father, once a prosperous rancher, had fallen on hard times after her mother's death 2 years prior. The drought had devastated their cattle, and debts had piled higher than the hay in their dwindling barn. But to sell her off like chattel to a stranger? She crumpled the telegram in her fist. Bad news? Martha, their housekeeper and the only mother figure Grace had known since she was 16, appeared in the doorway. "Father's marrying me off," Grace said, her voice hollow, "to a man I've never met." Martha's weathered face fell. "Oh, child?" She reached for Grace's hand. "When?" "Sunday. They arrive Wednesday." Grace turned away, fighting tears. "I should have expected this. Father always viewed me as a possession rather than a daughter." "What will you do?" Martha asked. Grace straightened her shoulders, her chin lifting in the defiance she'd inherited from her late mother. "I don't know yet. But I won't be sold like one of Father's cattle." Inside, Grace climbed the stairs to her bedroom and opened the drawer of her writing desk, retrieving a small pouch of coins, her savings from selling eggs and hand-sewn items in town over the years. It wasn't much, but perhaps enough to buy her passage somewhere far from here. San Francisco, maybe, or Denver. But leaving would mean abandoning Martha, who had nowhere else to go. It would mean leaving the only home she'd ever known, the ranch her mother had loved so dearly. Grace sank onto her bed, feeling the walls of her future closing in around her. The next morning, Grace rode into town, determined to speak with Mrs. Whitaker at the telegraph office. Perhaps she could send a message to her father, imploring him to reconsider. Timber Creek was a small but growing settlement, with a main street featuring a general store, saloon, telegraph office, small hotel, and the newly built church that stood at the far end. The town bustled with more activity than usual. A cattle drive had arrived, and cowboys filled the streets, their spurs jingling as they walked from the saloon to the general store and back again. Grace tied her horse outside the telegraph office and stepped inside. Mrs. Whitaker looked up from her desk, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose. "Grace, dear, I wondered if I'd see you after sending that message yesterday." "Mrs. Whitaker, I need to send a telegram to my father in Helena. It's urgent." The older woman's expression softened. "I'm afraid your father's already left Helena, according to the telegram I received this morning. He's on his way here with your intended." Grace's heart sank. "When will they arrive?" "Tomorrow, not Wednesday. The stage is making good time." Tomorrow. She had even less time than she'd thought. Grace thanked Mrs. Whitaker and stepped back onto the boardwalk, her mind racing with dwindling options. As she untied her horse, she heard a commotion from the saloon across the street. A man stumbled through the swinging doors, followed by another who grabbed him by the collar and threw him into the street. Grace recognized the second man as Flynn Anderson, the foreman from the neighboring Rocking a Ranch. She'd seen him around town a few times over the years, but they'd rarely spoken. He had a reputation as a hard worker and a fair man, though he kept mostly to himself. Flynn Anderson stood over the fallen man, his stance wide. "You come back in there talking about cheating again, and you'll get more than a bruised ego, Carter." The man called Carter scrambled to his feet, hand hovering near his gun. "You think you're something special because old man Wright left you his spread? You're still just a hired hand playing at being a rancher." Flynn's expression darkened. "I earned that ranch fair and square. Now get on your horse and ride out before I forget I'm trying to be a respectable citizen these days." Several onlookers chuckled, and Carter, seeing he was outnumbered, backed away. "This ain't over, Anderson." "It is, if you've got any sense," Flynn replied evenly. Grace couldn't help but watch the exchange. Flynn Anderson stood tall and composed, his dark hair falling across his forehead, his blue eyes intense under the brim of his hat. Unlike the other cowboys in town, he wore no flashy bandana or fancy boots, just practical, well-worn clothing suited to hard work. He couldn't have been more than 28 or 29, but there was a gravity to him that spoke of experiences beyond his years. As Carter slunk away, Flynn turned and caught Grace watching. He tipped his hat politely. "Miss Albright, sorry about the disturbance." Grace nodded, surprised he knew her name. "Mr. Anderson." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You all right, miss? You look troubled." Something in his direct gaze made Grace consider, for a wild moment, telling this virtual stranger everything. Instead, she simply said, "Family matters. Nothing to concern others with." "Family matters often concern others eventually," he said with unexpected insight, "especially in a town this size." "Yes, well," Grace mounted her horse. "I should be getting back to the ranch," Flynn nodded, studying her with those piercing blue eyes. "If you need anything, the rocking A is just over the ridge from your place." "That's kind, but I doubt you can help with this particular problem." With that, Grace turned her horse and rode away, feeling Flynn's gaze on her back long after she'd left the town behind. Back at the ranch, Grace found Martha hanging freshly laundered sheets in the yard. The older woman took one look at Grace's face and stopped her work. "They're coming tomorrow," Grace said without preamble. "Not Wednesday." Martha dropped the sheet she was holding. "Tomorrow? But we're not prepared. The house isn't ready for guests and—" "Martha," Grace interrupted gently, "I don't think Father cares about the state of the house. He only cares about completing this transaction." Martha's face hardened. "Don't you talk that way, Grace Albright. Your father may have his faults, but he loves you in his way." "His way is to trade me for whatever this Mr. Holton is offering," Grace replied bitterly. "That's not love." Martha sighed and returned to hanging the sheets. "Well, standing here won't prepare us for tomorrow. We'd best get to work. I'll need to slaughter a chicken for dinner and start baking." Grace knew Martha was right. Regardless of her feelings about this arrangement, she couldn't disgrace her father by presenting an unprepared household. She spent the afternoon cleaning the guest room, where Mr. Holton would presumably stay, changing the linens and dusting the furniture that had sat unused since her mother's passing. As she worked, Grace considered her options. She could run away tonight, but where would she go? She had some savings, but not enough to start a new life completely alone. She could refuse the marriage outright, but her father had legal authority over her, and she had no doubt he would enforce his will. By nightfall, the house was spotless, smelling of beeswax polish and Martha's fresh-baked bread. Grace sat at her writing desk, composing a letter she knew she might never send. "Dear Father," she wrote, "I understand your concerns for the ranch and our financial situation. However, I cannot in good conscience marry a man I have never met, regardless of the advantages such a union might bring." She wrote long into the night, crossing out lines and restarting paragraphs, trying to find the words that might persuade her father to reconsider. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she fell asleep at her desk, the unfinished letter beneath her cheek. Grace awoke at dawn, stiff and disoriented. She quickly changed her rumpled dress and hurried downstairs to help Martha prepare for their guest's arrival. The stage from Helena would reach Timber Creek by noon, and her father would likely bring Mr. Holton directly to the ranch. "How do you think he'll be?" Grace asked Martha as they prepared breakfast. "This Mr. Holton." Martha cracked eggs into a bowl. "I imagine he must be wealthy if your father thinks he can save the ranch. Beyond that, who can say? Perhaps he'll be handsome and kind. And perhaps pigs will fly," Grace muttered. "Mind your tongue," Martha scolded, but her eyes twinkled. "Your mother would want you to approach this with an open heart." My mother would never have allowed Father to arrange a marriage for me without my consent, Grace replied. She believed in marrying for love as she did. Martha's expression softened. That she did. And for all their differences, your father loved her fiercely. Then why wouldn't he want the same for me? Times have changed, child. The drought has been hard on everyone. Your father is doing what he thinks best to secure your future. Grace had no answer for that. She finished preparing breakfast in silence, her thoughts turning again to Flynn Anderson. There had been something in his eyes when he'd spoken to her, a quiet strength, a steadiness she'd rarely encountered. She shook the thought away. What did it matter now? By midday, Grace had changed into her best day dress, a pale blue cotton with a white lace collar, and sat stiffly in the parlor, waiting. Martha bustled about, adjusting cushions and straightening already straight picture frames. The sound of wagon wheels on the gravel drive sent Grace's heart racing. She stood, smoothing her skirts as the front door opened, and her father's voice boomed through the house. "Martha! Grace! Come greet our guest!" Grace took a deep breath and stepped into the entryway. Her father stood just inside the door, his large frame blocking the man behind him. Jeremiah Albright had always been an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a full beard now streaked with gray. His eyes, the same green as Grace's, assessed her coolly. "Grace, you look well." He stepped aside. "May I present Mr. Elias Holton, your future husband?" The man who stepped forward made Grace's blood run cold. Elias Holton was at least 50 years old, with thinning gray hair and cold, calculating eyes that assessed her as one might appraise livestock. His expensive suit spoke of wealth, but the thin line of his mouth suggested a meanness of spirit. "Miss Albright," he said, taking her hand before she could offer it. His palm was soft, uncalloused, the hand of a man who had never worked a day in his life. "Your father spoke truly of your beauty, though he failed to mention those remarkable eyes." Grace withdrew her hand as quickly as propriety allowed. "Mr. Holton, welcome to our home." "Soon to be my home as well," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your father and I have come to an agreement that benefits us all. The Albright Ranch will continue under your family name, with my investment securing its future, and I shall have a young wife to comfort my declining years." Grace shot a look of disbelief at her father, who avoided her gaze. Martha appeared in the hallway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Dinner is ready whenever you gentlemen would like to eat," she announced. "Excellent." Jeremiah clapped his hands together. "We've had a long journey, and Holton here has been talking of your cooking since Helena, Martha." As they moved toward the dining room, Grace caught her father's arm. "May I have a word with you, Father? In private?" Jeremiah frowned but nodded. "Holton, why don't you go ahead with Martha? Grace and I will join you shortly." When they were alone in the parlor, Grace didn't mince words. "Father, I cannot marry that man. He's older than you are." "He's 47 and I'm 53, her father corrected. "And his age is irrelevant. What matters is that he can save this ranch your mother's ranch. Or would you prefer to see it sold to pay our debts?" "There must be another way," Grace insisted. "I could find work in town or—" "Doing what? Serving drinks to cowboys? Teaching children?" Jeremiah shook his head. "This is the best option, Grace. Holton is wealthy. He owns banks in Helena, Bozeman, and now he's opening one here in Timber Creek. He'll ensure you never want for anything." "Except love," Grace said quietly. "And choice." Her father's expression hardened. "Love is a luxury we cannot afford. Your mother and I had love, and look where it got us. She's gone, and I'm drowning in debt. Holton is offering to pay off everything and invest in modern farming methods that will drought-proof the ranch. In exchange for me. In exchange for a respectable marriage to a beautiful young woman who will give him the family he never had with his first wife," Jeremiah corrected. "It's done, Grace. The arrangements are made. The wedding is Sunday at the church, and I've invited the whole town to witness the union." Grace felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. "Sunday? This Sunday? That's only 4 days from now." "No sense in waiting. Holton needs to return to Helena next week to finalize the transfer of funds. Jeremiah softened slightly at her stricken expression. "It won't be so bad, Grace. He's a gentleman. He'll treat you well." "You don't know that," she whispered. "I know he's our only hope." Jeremiah straightened his jacket. "Now compose yourself and come to dinner. Don't embarrass me in front of your future husband." Dinner was an excruciating affair. Elias Holton dominated the conversation, speaking at length about his business ventures, his house in Helena, where Grace would soon be mistress, and his plans to modernize the Albright Ranch. "Of course, I'll need to hire a proper foreman," he said, cutting into his roast chicken. "Someone who understands modern methods. The old ways of ranching are finished in this new era." "I've been managing this ranch my whole life," Jeremiah protested. "And admirably, until the drought," Holton replied smoothly. "But times change, and methods must change with them. I'm thinking of bringing in someone from back east who understands scientific farming." Grace watched her father's face fall. So that was the arrangement, not just her hand in marriage, but her father's pride as well. Holton would own everything: the ranch, the house, and her. "Will you excuse me?" Grace stood suddenly. "I'm feeling unwell." Without waiting for a response, she fled the dining room and out the front door, gulping the cool evening air. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the landscape in hues of orange and purple. The beauty of it, the land she loved so deeply, only made her despair more acute. The ranch hands were settling in for the night in the bunkhouse some distance away. The cattle lowed softly in the pasture, and somewhere an owl called. This was her home, and she was about to lose it even while staying on its grounds. Grace walked to the corral fence and leaned against it, fighting tears. She couldn't marry Elias Holton. The very thought of being his wife made her skin crawl. But what choice did she have? Where could she go? What could she do? "Miss Albright?" The voice startled her. Grace whirled around to find Flynn Anderson dismounting from his horse just a few yards away. "Mr. Anderson, what are you doing here?" He approached slowly, as if afraid of frightening her. "I brought some breeding papers for your father, for that bull he purchased last fall. I've been meaning to deliver them for a while." Grace wiped at her eyes, embarrassed to be caught crying. "At this hour?" Flynn shrugged. "I was passing by. Saw the light in the windows and thought I'd drop them off." He studied her face. "You're upset." It wasn't a question. Grace turned back to the corral, gripping the rough wood of the fence. "It's nothing. It doesn't look like nothing." Flynn came to stand beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "I heard in town today that your father's returned with a man from Helena, a banker." News traveled fast in Timber Creek. Grace nodded stiffly. "And I heard there's to be a wedding on Sunday," Flynn continued, his voice careful. "Yes." The word emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Your wedding." Again, not a question. Grace looked at him then, really looked at him. In the fading light, his features were cast in shadow, but she could see the concern in his eyes. "My father arranged it," she said. "I'd never met Mr. Holton until today." Flynn was silent for a long moment. "And now that you have met him?" "He's old enough to be my father," Grace blurted out. "He's cold and calculating and sees me as nothing more than a brood mare to give him heirs in his declining years. But father says he'll save the ranch, pay our debts, and secure our future." "At the cost of yours," Flynn said quietly. "Yes." Grace was surprised by his understanding. Most men in Timber Creek would see nothing wrong with her father's arrangement. It was common enough for marriages to be made for practical reasons rather than romantic ones. "What will you do?" Flynn asked. "What can I do? I have nowhere to go, no way to support myself. Father has legal right to arrange my marriage, and he's invited the entire town to witness it." Flynn shifted, turning to face her fully. "Miss Albright, Grace, there might be another way." She looked up at him, confused. "What other way?" He seemed to struggle with his words. "The Rocking A is doing well. Better than well. Old man Wright left it to me free and clear, and I've doubled the herd in 3 years. I could, that is, I might be able to help with your father's financial troubles." Grace stared at him, uncomprehending. "Why would you do that?" Flynn removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. "Because no woman should be forced to marry against her will. Because I've admired you from afar for years. Because—" He took a deep breath. "Because I'd like the chance to court you properly, if you'd allow it." Grace felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. "Court me, but we barely know each other. I know you're kind to everyone in town, regardless of their station. I know you stayed to care for your father after your mother passed, even though most young women would have sought escape. I know you can ride as well as any cowhand and still charm the ladies at the church socials." A small smile played at his lips. "And I know you have the most captivating laugh I've ever heard." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "You've been watching me." "Noticing," he corrected. "There's a difference." Before Grace could respond, the front door of the house opened, spilling lamplight onto the porch. Elias Holton's silhouette appeared. "Grace, your father's concerned about you," he called, his voice carrying across the yard. "Who is that with you?" Flynn stepped back, placing his hat back on his head. "I should go. Think about what I said, Miss Albright. The offer stands." He pressed a folded paper into her hand. "The breeding papers. For your father." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing into the darkness just as Holton reached Grace's side. "Who is that man?" Holton demanded, his voice sharp. "A neighboring rancher," Grace replied, clutching the papers. "He brought some documents for my father." Holton's eyes narrowed. At this hour, quite inappropriate for a young woman to be speaking with a man alone after dark. "This is a ranch, Mr. Holton," Grace said, her spine stiffening. "People come and go at all hours on business." "Well, once we are married, such encounters will cease," he stated firmly. "A wife of mine will maintain proper decorum at all times." Grace bit her tongue to keep from retorting. Instead, she said, "I should give these papers to my father," and walked past Holton toward the house. Inside, her father and Martha were clearing the dinner table. Jeremiah looked up with a frown. "Where did you go? Holton had to leave the table to find you." "Mr. Anderson from the Rocking A brought these for you," Grace said, handing over the breeding papers. "I was just speaking with him outside." Her father's expression cleared. "Ah, yes. I've been expecting these. Holton, this is excellent timing. Anderson runs the most prosperous ranch in the county since old Wright left it to him. These papers certify the bloodline of our new bull-pure Hereford stock that will improve our herd significantly." Holton looked unimpressed. "I thought you said this Anderson was a hired hand who got lucky when his employer died." "Lucky, yes, but also smart," Jeremiah replied. "He's turned the Rocking A into the most modern operation within 100 miles, doubled the herd, implemented new breeding programs, dug irrigation systems that kept his grass green even through the worst of the drought." Grace watched with interest as Holton's expression darkened. Clearly, he didn't like hearing another man praised in such a manner. "Perhaps this Anderson would make a good foreman for our new operation," Holton suggested with a calculating look. "If he's as knowledgeable as you say." Jeremiah laughed. "Flynn Anderson wouldn't work for another man if you paid him double what he earns. He's his own master now and proud of it." "Every man has his price," Holton replied coldly. Grace excused herself and retreated to her room, her mind whirling with the evening's developments. Flynn Anderson had offered to help with their financial problems. He wanted to court her. The very idea sent a flutter through her chest that she quickly suppressed. She barely knew the man, despite his apparent years of noticing her. And yet, anything would be better than marriage to Elias Holton. The next morning, Grace awoke early and slipped out before anyone else was stirring. She saddled her mare and rode to the ridge that separated the Albright Ranch from the Rocking A. From this vantage point, she could see both properties spread out below her father's drought-stricken pastures, contrasting sharply with the verdant fields of Flynn Anderson's operation. The Rocking A ranch house was visible in the distance, smoke already rising from the chimney. Grace hesitated. It would be beyond improper for her to call on Flynn Anderson alone, especially with her engagement to Holton now widely known. But propriety seemed a small concern compared to a lifetime of misery. Decision made, she urged her horse down the slope toward the rocking A. As she approached, a ranch hand spotted her and called out a greeting. "Miss Albright, morning to you." Grace recognized him as Tom Daniels, a young cowhand who sometimes came into town for supplies. "Good morning, Mr. Daniels. Is Mr. Anderson available?" "Yes, madam. He's in the barn with the new foal. Shall I tell him you're here?" "Please." Grace dismounted and waited by the corral, watching as several hands moved cattle from one pasture to another. The operation was clearly well run, with modern fencing and a newly constructed windmill pumping water into a large reservoir. Flynn appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. When he spotted Grace, surprise and something like pleasure crossed his features. "Miss Albright, I wasn't expecting to see you today." "I needed to speak with you," Grace said, glancing around at the curious ranch hands. "In private, if possible." Flynn nodded. "Of course. We can talk in the house." He led her to the ranch house, a well-built structure that had been expanded since Old Man Wright's day. Inside, it was simply but comfortably furnished, with a large stone fireplace dominating the main room. "Would you like some coffee?" Flynn offered. "Mrs. Winters, my housekeeper, has already made a pot." "No, thank you," Grace replied, remaining standing. "I can't stay long. Mr. Holton will notice my absence if I'm not back soon." Flynn's expression darkened at the mention of Holton. "You've thought about my offer?" "Yes." Grace took a deep breath. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Anderson? You said you could help with my father's financial troubles, but I'm not sure what that means." Flynn gestured to a chair, and this time Grace sat. He took the seat across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I'm proposing to pay your father's debts in full," he said simply. "In exchange, he breaks off the engagement to Holton and allows me to court you properly, with the possibility of marriage if, and only if, you decide you want that." Grace stared at him. "Why would you do that? We barely know each other." "As I said last night, I've admired you for years," Flynn replied. "And I despise seeing anyone forced into a situation they don't want. I was once in a position where I had no choices, and someone helped me. I'd like to do the same for you." "What happened?" Grace asked, curious despite herself. A shadow crossed Flynn's face. "My father died when I was 14, leaving my mother and 5 younger siblings with nothing. I took work as a ranch hand, sending every penny home. By 16, I was working 16-hour days, and still not making enough to keep everyone fed. Then, James Wright hired me at the Rocking A. He paid me twice what other ranches offered, taught me everything he knew, and eventually made me his foreman. When he died 3 years ago, he left the ranch to me instead of his nephew back east. That's why you feel obligated to help others," Grace realized. Flynn shook his head. "Not obligation, understanding. I know what it's like to feel trapped." Grace studied him, seeing the sincerity in his blue eyes. "And if my father refuses your offer?" "Then I'll find another way," Flynn said firmly. "No woman should be forced to marry a man she doesn't love, especially not a man like Holton." "You know him?" Grace asked, surprised. Flynn's expression hardened. "I know of him. He's opened banks in several territories, foreclosed on more farms and ranches than I can count, and left families destitute. There are rumors that not all his business dealings are above board. My father seems to trust him." "Your father is desperate," Flynn replied gently. "Desperate men often trust the wrong people." Grace stood and moved to the window, looking out over the well-maintained ranch. "Even if my father agreed to your proposal, Holton won't simply walk away. He wants this ranch and me for reasons I don't fully understand." "Let me worry about Holton," Flynn said, coming to stand beside her. "Will you allow me to speak with your father?" Grace turned to face him. "Why me, Mr. Anderson? There are plenty of eligible young women in Timber Creek who would gladly marry a successful rancher without all this complication." Flynn's gaze softened. "Because none of them are you, Grace Albright. None of them ride out at dawn to check fence lines before breakfast, or organize collections for widows after church, or stand up to Ben Miller when he was bullying the Chinese laundryman last fall. Grace blushed. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed that particular incident. "You were watching." "Noticing," he corrected again, with a small smile. "There's a difference." Something warm unfurled in Grace's chest, something she hadn't expected to feel. "I should go," she said, breaking the moment. "They'll be looking for me." Flynn nodded. "I'll ride over this afternoon to speak with your father." "Holton won't like it," Grace warned. "I'm not concerned with what Holton likes," Flynn replied, his jaw set with determination. "Only with what you want." What she wanted? It had been so long since anyone had asked her that, Grace wasn't sure she knew anymore. But she was certain of one thing: she didn't want to marry Elias Holton. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson." "Flynn," he said. "If we're to be friends at least, I'd like you to call me Flynn." "Flynn," she repeated, testing the name. It felt right somehow. "Then you must call me Grace." He smiled. A genuine smile that lit his eyes. Grace. The way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine. She turned quickly and headed for the door. "I'll see you this afternoon, then." As Grace rode back to her ranch, her mind raced with possibilities. Could Flynn Anderson really convince her father to break the engagement to Holton? And if he did, what then? The idea of being courted by Flynn both thrilled and terrified her. He was handsome, certainly, and kind from all accounts. But marriage? She hardly knew him. Still, as she crested the ridge and saw Elias Holton standing on the porch of her home, watching her approach with narrow, suspicious eyes, she knew she'd rather take her chances with Flynn Anderson than face a lifetime with Holton. Grace dismounted in the yard, bracing herself for Holton's questions. "Where have you been?" he demanded, stepping off the porch. "Your father and I have been looking for you." "I went riding," Grace replied simply. "I often do in the mornings." "Alone? Without a chaperone or escort?" Holton's lips thinned with disapproval. "That's most inappropriate for a young lady of your standing." "My standing?" "Mr. Holton, I live on a ranch. I've been riding these hills alone since I was 12 years old." "Well, that will change after Sunday," he said firmly. "A wife of mine will conduct herself with proper decorum at all times. No more of this galloping about the countryside unescorted." Grace felt her temper rising. "Mr. Holton, I believe you misunderstand the nature of life in the West. Women here." "I understand perfectly," he interrupted. "The West is uncivilized, which is why proper Eastern customs must be established. You'll find Helena much more refined than this backward little settlement. Once we're married, we'll return there immediately." "Leave the ranch?" Grace hadn't considered this possibility. "But my father will remain here to oversee the improvements I'm financing," Holton finished for her. "He seems quite capable in that regard at least." Grace felt as though the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. Holton intended to take her away from everything and everyone she knew to a city where she would be entirely under his control. "I see," she managed, her voice faint. "I'm glad we understand each other," Holton said with a satisfied nod. "Now, your father is waiting to discuss the wedding arrangements. The pastor will be joining us for lunch." Grace followed him into the house, her resolve hardening with each step. She had to find a way out of this marriage, and Flynn Anderson might be her only hope. Inside, her father sat at the dining table with Pastor Williams, a kindly man in his 60s who had served the Timber Creek Church for nearly 20 years. "Ah, Grace," Pastor Williams rose as she entered. "There you are, my dear. Your father has been telling me the happy news of your engagement." Grace forced a smile. "Pastor Williams, how nice to see you." "We were just discussing the ceremony," Jeremiah said, his tone warning Grace to be polite. "Pastor has agreed to perform it on Sunday, as requested." "So soon?" Pastor Williams looked concerned. "Usually I prefer to meet with the couple several times before the wedding, to ensure they understand the commitment they're making." I assure you, we understand perfectly, Holton interjected smoothly. Unfortunately, my business affairs require that we proceed without delay. I must return to Helena next week. Pastor Williams's kind eyes rested on Grace. And you, my dear, are you prepared for this step? Grace felt all eyes on her father's gaze particularly hard. Before she could respond, Martha appeared in the doorway. Lunch is ready, she announced. Shall I serve it now? Yes, thank you, Martha, Jeremiah said quickly, clearly relieved by the interruption. As they moved to the dining room, Pastor Williams fell into step beside Grace. You seem troubled, child, he said softly. Is everything as it should be? Grace hesitated. Pastor Williams had known her since childhood and had been a source of comfort after her mother's death, but could she confide in him about her forced marriage without angering her father? It's all happening very quickly, she said carefully. The pastor nodded. Marriage is a sacred covenant, not to be entered into lightly or in haste. If you have concerns, Grace, you should voice them now, before vows are exchanged. Thank you, Pastor, Grace whispered as they reached the dining room. I'll remember that. Lunch was an awkward affair, with Holton dominating the conversation with tales of his business success in Helena and plans for modernizing the ranch. Grace picked at her food, her appetite gone, while her father nodded enthusiastically at every suggestion Holton made. And of course, we'll need to replace most of the current ranch hands, Holton was saying. Bring in men who understand modern methods. Replace them? Grace couldn't remain silent any longer. But some of these men have worked for my father for years. This is their home. Holton gave her a patronizing smile. My dear, sentiment has no place in business. Progress requires change, and change often means replacement. These aren't pieces of equipment, Mr. Holton, Grace argued. They're men with families who depend on them. Grace, her father warned, Mr. Holton knows what's best for the ranch. Does he? Grace challenged. Or does he simply want to remove anyone loyal to you, Father, so that his control is absolute? A tense silence fell over the table. Holton's expression hardened, while Pastor Williams looked increasingly uncomfortable. I believe I should be going, the pastor said, rising from his seat. Thank you for lunch, Mr. Albright. I'll walk you out, Grace offered quickly, seizing the chance to escape the table. Outside on the porch, Pastor Williams turned to Grace with concern. My child, if this marriage is not of your choosing, you must say so now. Grace glanced back at the house. Pastor, what happens if I refuse to say my vows on Sunday? The older man's eyes widened. Then there can be no marriage. I cannot and will not bind together two people unless both freely consent. He studied her face. Grace, is your father forcing this match? Before she could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Flynn Anderson rode into the yard, his expression determined. He dismounted and approached the porch, removing his hat. Pastor Williams, Miss Albright. Mr. Anderson, the pastor greeted him. What brings you to the Albright Ranch today? I need to speak with Mr. Albright on an urgent matter, Flynn replied, his eyes meeting Grace's briefly. He's inside with Mr. Holton, Grace said. They're discussing wedding plans. Something flashed in Flynn's eyes, determination, perhaps, or anger. Good. I'd like to speak with both of them. Pastor Williams looked between the two of them, understanding dawning on his face. I see. Well, I should be on my way. Grace, remember what I said. No vows can be forced. With that, the pastor descended the porch steps, nodded to Flynn, and mounted his waiting horse. Once he was gone, Flynn turned to Grace. Are you ready for this? Grace straightened her shoulders. Yes. It's time someone stood up to both of them. Together, they entered the house. In the dining room, Jeremiah and Holton were deep in conversation, heads bent over papers spread across the table. Father, Grace announced, Mr. Anderson is here to see you. Both men looked up, surprise quickly turning to suspicion on Holton's face. Anderson, Jeremiah acknowledged, rising from his seat. What brings you here? Is there an issue with the breeding papers? No, sir, Flynn replied, his voice steady. I've come on a different matter entirely. A proposition for you. Holton stood as well, his posture stiff. We're rather busy at the moment, Mr. Anderson. Perhaps you could return another day. This concerns you as well, Mr. Holton, Flynn said, meeting the older man's gaze directly. In fact, it directly impacts the arrangements you've been making with Mr. Albright. Jeremiah frowned. What's this about, Anderson? Flynn glanced at Grace, who gave him a slight nod of encouragement. I'm prepared to pay off all the Albright Ranch's debts, every cent, in exchange for two things. And what might those be? Jeremiah asked, his interest clearly piqued despite his wariness. First, that you cancel the arranged marriage between Miss Albright and Mr. Holton. Flynn's voice remained calm and businesslike. Second, that you allow me to court your daughter properly, with the understanding that any future between us would be her choice entirely. A heavy silence fell over the room. Jeremiah's mouth opened and closed several times, while Holton's face darkened with anger. This is outrageous, Holton finally sputtered. The arrangements have already been made. The wedding is on Sunday. No arrangements are final until vows are exchanged, Flynn countered, and according to Pastor Williams, those vows must be freely given. Jeremiah turned to Grace. You put him up to this? I went to Mr. Anderson for help, Grace admitted, because I will not marry Mr. Holton. You ungrateful girl, her father growled, after everything I've done to secure your future. My future? Grace interrupted. Or yours, Father. Mr. Holton plans to take me to Helena after the wedding. Did you know that? He plans to replace your ranch hands with his own men. Did you know that too? Jeremiah looked uncertainly at Holton. Is this true? Of course, Holton replied dismissively. The ranch needs modernizing, and Grace will be better suited to city life as my wife. These are details we would have discussed in due course. After the wedding, when it was too late, Grace pointed out, Jeremiah ran a hand through his graying hair. Anderson, what exactly are you offering? $15,000, Flynn stated. Enough to clear your debts and make necessary improvements to drought-proof the ranch for the future. And in return, you get my daughter, Jeremiah said flatly. No, Flynn corrected firmly. In return, I get the chance to court your daughter properly. Whether anything comes of it is entirely up to her. This is absurd, Holton interjected. Albright, we had an agreement. The papers are drawn up. The wedding is arranged. Papers can be torn up, Flynn said. Arrangements can be changed. Holton turned to Jeremiah. Do you really think this cowboy can offer what I can? I'm proposing to invest twice what he's offering. I have connections throughout the territory. I can ensure your ranch not only survives, but thrives. At what cost? Flynn challenged. How many ranches have you saved before foreclosing on them, Holton? How many families have you left destitute after promising them prosperity? Holton's face flushed with anger. You know nothing of my business affairs. I know enough, Flynn replied. I know you've been buying up distressed properties all over the territory, promising assistance, and then taking control when the owners can't meet your terms. I know you've been manipulating land prices through your banks, creating the very hardships you then offer to solve. Jeremiah looked between the two men, confusion and doubt warring on his face. Is this true? Holton? Of course not, Holton scoffed. Anderson is clearly jealous and trying to sabotage our arrangement. The question is, Albright, who are you going to believe? A successful businessman who can save your ranch, or a cowboy who got lucky when his employer died? A lucky cowboy who's offering to pay off all my debts with no strings attached, Jeremiah pointed out, except permission to court my daughter. And when the money's gone, Holton pressed. What then? Anderson doesn't have my resources or connections. My ranch is profitable, Mr. Albright, Flynn said quietly. I've tripled the Rocking A's value in 3 years. I know how to make a ranch work even in drought conditions. I can help you do the same here. Grace watched her father carefully. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the temptation of Holton's larger offer against Flynn's straightforward proposal, and the doubts now planted about Holton's true intentions. Father, she said softly, please. I'm asking you to consider Mr. Anderson's offer, not just for my sake, but for yours and the ranch's as well." Jeremiah's eyes met hers, and for the first time in years he seemed to really see her. "You truly don't want to marry Holton?" "I don't," Grace confirmed. "I've tried to tell you that since you arrived." Holton slammed his hand on the table. "This is preposterous. We have an agreement, Albright. Are you really going to let your daughter and this upstart rancher dictate terms to you?" Jeremiah straightened, something of his old pride returning to his bearing. "My wife, Grace's mother, would never have forgiven me for forcing our daughter into a marriage she doesn't want. I was blinded by desperation and pride." He turned to Holton. "I'm sorry, but I'm withdrawing my consent to this marriage." Holton's face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this, Albright, both of you." He jabbed a finger at Flynn. "And you've made a powerful enemy today." "Wouldn't be the first time," Flynn replied evenly. Holton gathered his papers with shaking hands. "I'll be staying in town until I can arrange transport back to Helena. When you come to your senses, Albright, don't expect my offer to still stand." With that, he stormed from the room. The front door slammed moments later, and they heard the sound of a horse galloping away. Jeremiah sank into a chair, suddenly looking every day of his 53 years. "I've been a fool." Flynn remained standing. "No, sir. Just a father trying to secure his daughter's future." "By selling her to the highest bidder?" Jeremiah shook his head. "Catherine would be ashamed of me." "Mother would understand you were trying to save her ranch," Grace said gently, placing a hand on her father's shoulder. Jeremiah covered her hand with his own. "Anderson, your offer, is it still open?" "Yes, sir," Flynn replied. "I'll have the bank draft delivered tomorrow." "And your intentions toward my daughter?" Flynn's eyes met Grace's. "Honorable, sir. I'd like the chance to court her properly, as I said. What happens beyond that would be entirely her decision." Jeremiah nodded slowly. "Very well, I accept your terms." He rose from his chair. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need some time alone." After her father left the room, Grace turned to Flynn, emotions warring within her. "Thank you," she said simply. "Don't thank me yet," Flynn replied. "Holton isn't the type to give up easily. He'll find a way to retaliate." "Let him try," Grace said with more confidence than she felt. "We're stronger together than alone." Flynn's eyes warmed at her words. "Does that mean you'll allow me to court you, Miss Albright?" Grace felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "I believe it does, Mr. Anderson." A smile spread across Flynn's face, transforming his normally serious expression. "Then I'd be honored if you would join me for dinner tomorrow evening, at my ranch. Mrs. Winters is an excellent cook." "I'd like that," Grace replied, surprised at how much she meant it. Flynn reached for her hand, his touch gentle as he raised it to his lips in a brief, respectful kiss. "Until tomorrow, then." After he left, Grace found Martha in the kitchen, anxiously kneading bread dough. "I heard shouting," Martha said, "and Mr. Holton rode out like the devil himself was chasing him. What happened?" Grace explained everything, watching Martha's expression shift from concern to surprise to cautious approval. "Flynn Anderson, eh?" Martha wiped flour from her hands. "He's a good man, from all I've heard. Works hard, treats his hands well. Old man Wright wouldn't have left him the ranch otherwise." "I barely know him," Grace admitted, "but he stood up to Holton when no one else would. He offered to help Father without demanding anything in return except the chance to court me." Martha smiled knowingly. "And how do you feel about being courted by Mr. Anderson?" Grace couldn't help the smile that tugged at her lips. Curious, nervous, but not afraid. Not like with Holton. "That's a start," Martha said. "A very good start indeed." The next day passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Flynn delivered the bank draft to Jeremiah, who rode into town to pay off the ranch's outstanding debts. When he returned, he seemed lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Anderson was right about Holton," Jeremiah told Grace that afternoon. "I spoke with Sheriff Davis in town. Apparently Holton's bank in Bozeman foreclosed on 6 ranches last year after offering loans with terms that were impossible to meet. The families were left with nothing." That would have been us, Grace said quietly. Jeremiah nodded, his expression grave. I was blind, desperate. I'm sorry, Grace. It's over now, she assured him. We can start fresh. As evening approached, Grace found herself unusually nervous about her dinner with Flynn. She changed her dress 3 times before settling on a simple blue gown that her mother had always said brought out the color of her eyes. Martha helped her arrange her hair, pinning the golden brown locks into a neat chignon with a few soft curls framing her face. You look beautiful, Martha said with satisfaction. Your mother would be proud. Of me allowing a man to court me, Grace asked with a small smile. Of you standing up for yourself, Martha corrected. Catherine always said you had her spirit. Today proved her right. When Flynn arrived to escort her to the rocking A, he looked different, still unmistakably a rancher, but his usual work clothes had been replaced with a clean white shirt, dark vest, and well-polished boots. His dark hair was neatly combed, though a rebellious lock still fell across his forehead. You look lovely, he said, his eyes appreciative but respectful as they took in her appearance. Thank you, Grace replied, suddenly shy. You clean up rather well yourself. The ride to the rocking A was pleasant, with Flynn pointing out improvements he'd made to his property and asking Grace's opinion on various matters relating to ranching. It struck her that he spoke to her as an equal, valuing her thoughts rather than dismissing them as Holton had done. Mrs. Winters, Flynn's housekeeper, had prepared a delicious meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh vegetables from the ranch's garden. The dining room was simply but elegantly set, with a vase of wildflowers as a centerpiece. This is wonderful, Grace said as they sat down to eat. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for accepting, Flynn replied. I've been wanting to do this for a long time. How long? Grace asked curiously. You said you've noticed me for years. Flynn seemed almost embarrassed. Since the Founders' Day dance 3 years ago. You were wearing a yellow dress and you danced with every old-timer who asked, including Mr. Jenkins with his wooden leg. You made each of them feel like the most important person in the room. Grace remembered that night. That was right after Mother died. I almost didn't go, but Martha insisted I needed to get out of the house. I wanted to ask you to dance, Flynn admitted. But I was just the rocking a foreman then. Your father would have considered me presumptuous. And now? Grace asked softly. Flynn's blue eyes held hers. Now I hope I've proven myself worthy of at least the chance to know you better. You stood up to my father and Holton to help me, Grace said. I'd say that's a good start. Their conversation flowed easily throughout dinner, moving from ranch matters to books they'd read to childhood memories. Grace was surprised to discover that Flynn had grown up in Missouri before coming west after his father's death, and that he shared her love of Dickens novels. Old Man Wright had quite a library, Flynn explained. He taught me to read properly during the winters when ranch work slowed. Said a man needed to exercise his mind as well as his body. He sounds like a good man, Grace observed. The best, Flynn agreed, like a father to me after mine was gone. That's why I worked so hard to make the ranch successful after he left it to me. I wanted to honor his faith in me. After dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the chirping of crickets. It's peaceful here, Grace said at last. You've built something good, Flynn. I hope to build something better, he replied, his voice low. Something lasting. The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Grace turned to find him watching her, his expression open and earnest. Flynn, I need to be honest with you, she said carefully. I'm grateful for what you did, standing up to Holton and helping my father. But I don't want you to think I feel obligated to develop feelings for you because of it. I would never want that, Flynn said immediately. Grace, when I offered to court you, I meant exactly that. A chance to get to know each other, to see if there might be something between us. Nothing more, nothing less. He paused. If you decide, after a proper courtship, that your heart lies elsewhere, I'll accept that with no hard feelings. My help came with no strings attached. Grace studied his face in the fading light, seeing nothing but sincerity there. "Thank you for understanding." "Of course." Flynn hesitated, then added, "Though I hope you'll give me a fair chance to win your affection." Something warm bloomed in Grace's chest. "I believe I already am." The week passed in a pleasant blur. Flynn called on Grace daily, sometimes just for brief visits, other times taking her riding to show her innovations he'd implemented at the Rocking A that might work on her father's ranch as well. Jeremiah, seemingly eager to make amends for his previous actions, encouraged the courtship, even joining them for dinner one evening at Flynn's invitation. By unspoken agreement, they avoided town, knowing that Holton was still there and that rumors were likely flying about the canceled wedding. But on Saturday, the day before what would have been her wedding day, Grace decided it was time to face whatever gossip might be circulating. "I need to speak with Pastor Williams," she told Flynn when he arrived that morning, "and I should pick up some supplies from the general store. Would you mind accompanying me to town?" "Are you sure?" Flynn asked. "Holton might still be there." "All the more reason not to go alone," Grace replied. "But I won't hide on my own ranch forever. People will talk regardless. Better to show my face and let them see I'm not ashamed of my decision." Flynn nodded, admiration in his eyes. "Then I'd be honored to escort you." As they rode into Timber Creek side by side, Grace was acutely aware of the curious glances and whispers that followed them down the main street. News of the canceled wedding had clearly spread, and her appearance with Flynn was causing quite a stir. They tied their horses outside the general store, and Flynn offered his arm as they climbed the steps to the boardwalk. Grace accepted it, drawing strength from his steady presence. Inside the store, Mrs. Peterson, the owner's wife, greeted them with barely concealed curiosity. "Miss Albright, Mr. Anderson, what a surprise to see you both." "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson," Grace replied pleasantly. "I need a few supplies today." As Grace selected items from the shelves, she could hear Mrs. Peterson whispering urgently to another customer. Fragments of their conversation reached her ears. Wedding canceled, Anderson paid, Holton furious. Flynn must have heard too, for he moved closer to Grace, his presence protective without being possessive. "Don't let them bother you," he said quietly. "I'm not," Grace assured him, though in truth, the whispers stung more than she wanted to admit. As they were paying for their purchases, the store's door opened, and Elias Holton himself entered. He stopped short at the sight of Grace and Flynn, his face darkening with anger. "Well," he said coldly, "if it isn't the happy couple." Grace stiffened, but Flynn's hand at her elbow steadied her. "Mr. Holton," she acknowledged with a nod. "I trust you're satisfied with your choice, Miss Albright," Holton continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "Trading a future as a banker's wife in Helena for life with a glorified cowhand." Before Grace could respond, Flynn spoke, his voice level but firm. "Mr. Holton, I understand you're disappointed, but I'd appreciate it if you'd speak to Miss Albright with respect." "Respect?" Holton laughed harshly. "She deserves none after breaking our engagement for a pretty face and a few sweet words. But then, women are notoriously fickle creatures, aren't they?" Grace felt her temper rising. "Our engagement was arranged without my knowledge or consent, Mr. Holton. I broke nothing that was rightfully formed." "Your father gave his word," Holton snapped. "My father had no right to promise what wasn't his to give my future," Grace retorted. "And from what I've learned of your business practices since then, I consider myself fortunate to have escaped." Holton's face flushed with anger. "You'll regret crossing me, both of you." He turned to Flynn. "Enjoy your victory while it lasts, Anderson. It won't be long before the Albright Ranch is mine anyway." Flynn's expression hardened. "Is that a threat?" "Holton?" "A promise," Holton replied with a cold smile. "I always get what I want in the end." With that, he turned and stormed out of the store, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Mrs. Peterson broke it first. "Well, the nerve of that man." Her outrage seemed to break a dam, and suddenly the other customers in the store were expressing their support for Grace and Flynn. "Never did trust that city feller," declared old Mr. Jenkins. "Too slick by half." "My Henry works over at the Rocking A," added Mrs. Taylor. "Says Mr. Anderson runs the finest spread in the county. You could do worse, Miss Albright." Grace felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The townspeople might gossip, but it seemed many of them were on her side. After finishing their shopping, Grace and Flynn visited Pastor Williams at the church. The elderly pastor welcomed them warmly. "I'm glad to see you looking so well, Grace," he said. "Much happier than when I saw you last." "I am happier," Grace admitted. "Thanks in part to Mr. Anderson." Pastor Williams nodded approvingly. "I've known Flynn since he first came to work for James Wright. He's a good man with a strong faith." He looked between them. "Am I to understand there is a courtship in progress?" Flynn looked to Grace before answering. "Yes, Pastor. With Mr. Albright's blessing." "Excellent," the pastor beamed. "Much better than a hasty wedding to a stranger, wouldn't you agree?" As they left the church, Flynn suggested they stop at the cafe for lunch before heading back to the ranch. Grace agreed, feeling more confident now that they'd faced the town's scrutiny and found more support than censure. The cafe was crowded with the Saturday lunch crowd, and their entrance caused a momentary lull in conversation before it resumed at an even more animated level. The owner, Mrs. Collins, hurried over to seat them at a small table near the window. "Don't you mind the gossips," she told Grace in a stage whisper. "Half the town thinks you're the bravest girl in Montana for standing up to that Holton fellow, and the other half wishes they'd had the courage to do the same in similar situations." Grace smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins." As they ate, Flynn told Grace about his plans to expand the Rocking A's herd further and possibly invest in some of the new irrigation techniques being developed back east. "I've been corresponding with an agricultural expert at a college in Ohio," he explained. "He believes we could increase grass production by 30% with the right water management." "That would make a tremendous difference during drought years," Grace said, genuinely interested. "Father always said water was worth more than gold in ranching." "Your father's right," Flynn agreed. "I'd like to implement some of these techniques on your ranch too, if he's amenable. The Albright land has even better natural water sources than the Rocking A." Grace was touched by his continued interest in helping her family's ranch. "I'm sure he'd welcome your advice. He respects you, you know, more than he lets on." Flynn looked pleased. That means a lot coming from a rancher of his experience. As they were finishing their meal, Sheriff Davis entered the cafe and made his way directly to their table. "Anderson, Miss Albright." He nodded to them both. "Glad I caught you in town. There's something you should know." Flynn straightened. "What is it, Sheriff?" "Had a telegram from the marshal in Helena this morning," Davis said, keeping his voice low. "Seems your friend Holton is under investigation for some questionable banking practices. Nothing proven yet, but they're looking into reports of fraud, among other things." Grace exchanged a glance with Flynn. "Does my father know?" "Stopped by your ranch this morning, but he'd already left for the south pasture," the sheriff replied. "Thought you should be warned, though. Men like Holton, when they're backed into a corner, can be dangerous. He's been making threats in the saloon about getting even." "We heard some of those threats firsthand," Flynn said grimly. "Thanks for the warning. Sheriff?" Davis nodded. "Just keep your eyes open, both of you. Holton's checking out on Monday's stage, according to the hotel register. Try to avoid him until then if you can." After the sheriff left, Flynn looked troubled. "Perhaps we should head back to the ranch now. I don't like the idea of your father out there alone if Holton's making threats." "Father can take care of himself," Grace assured him. "But yes, I think we should go back." They paid for their meal and retrieved their horses. As they rode out of town, Grace noticed Flynn scanning the streets carefully, as if looking for any sign of Holton. "Do you really think he might try something?" she asked. Flynn's expression was serious. "Men like Holton don't take rejection well, and if the sheriff's right about an investigation in Helena, he might be desperate. We should be cautious until he's gone." They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought. The road to the Albright Ranch wound through a stretch of pine forest before opening onto the rangeland. As they entered the trees, Flynn suddenly reined in his horse. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Grace listened. I don't hear anything. Exactly. No birds. Flynn's eyes scanned the trees ahead. Something's not right. Before Grace could respond, a shot rang out, splintering bark on a tree just inches from Flynn's head. Flynn immediately spurred his horse forward, reaching over to grab the reins of Grace's mount. Ride! He shouted, urging both horses into a gallop as another shot echoed through the trees. Grace clung to her saddle as Flynn led them off the road and into the denser forest, branches whipping past them as they fled. Behind them, she heard the sound of hoofbeats in pursuit. Who is it? She called to Flynn. Can't be sure, but I'd wager it's Holton or someone working for him, Flynn replied grimly. Hold on. They burst from the trees into a small clearing, and Flynn finally slowed their headlong flight. He quickly dismounted and helped Grace down from her horse. We need to get to cover, he said, leading her toward a rocky outcropping at the edge of the clearing. The horses are too visible in the open. Once they reached the rocks, Flynn positioned Grace behind the largest boulder and checked his revolver. Stay down, he instructed. I'm going to try to circle back and see who's following us. No, Grace grabbed his arm. It's too dangerous. We should stay together. Flynn hesitated, then nodded. You're right. We don't know how many there are. He crouched beside her, his eyes scanning the tree line. If it's Holton, he's unlikely to be alone. They didn't have to wait long. 2 riders emerged from the forest, moving cautiously into the clearing. Grace recognized Elias Holton immediately, his city clothes incongruous on horseback. The second man was rough-looking, with a scarred face and the hard eyes of a hired gun. Anderson! Holton called out. I know you're here somewhere. Show yourself. Flynn remained silent, his hand on his revolver. You've got the girl with you, don't you? Holton continued. Come out now, and maybe I'll let her go unharmed. Grace felt a chill at his words. Flynn's jaw tightened, but he still didn't respond. Holton signaled to his companion, who dismounted and began approaching the rocks where they were hiding, his gun drawn. Last chance, Anderson, Holton called, or Carter here will find you, and he's not known for his gentle touch. Carter. The name registered with Grace, the same man Flynn had thrown out of the saloon the day she'd received the telegram. No wonder he'd agreed to help Holton. Flynn leaned close to whisper in Grace's ear. When I move, stay down. Don't come out no matter what you hear, understand? Grace nodded, fear clutching at her heart. Flynn squeezed her hand once, then moved silently along the rocks, positioning himself to flank Carter as the man approached their hiding place. Grace held her breath as Carter drew nearer, his boots crunching on the rocky ground. When he was just a few feet away from her position, Flynn suddenly stepped out from behind a boulder. That's far enough, Carter, he said, his revolver leveled at the man's chest. Carter froze, then smiled unpleasantly. Well, look who it is. Been waiting for this, Anderson. Drop the gun, Flynn ordered. Instead of complying, Carter dove to the side, firing as he moved. Flynn returned fire, and Carter cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell behind a rock. Carter! Holton shouted from horseback. Get up, you fool! Flynn used the distraction to move to a better position, but as he did, Holton drew his own pistol and fired. The bullet struck the rock near Flynn's head, sending stone splinters flying. Grace gasped as she saw blood on Flynn's temple where a fragment had cut him. He wiped it away, seemingly unaware of the injury, his focus entirely on the threat. Carter was struggling to his feet, his left arm hanging useless at his side. You'll pay for that, Anderson, he growled. Flynn kept his revolver trained on Carter but called out to Holton. It's over, Holton. The sheriff knows about the investigation in Helena. How do you think it will look if you add murder to your charges? There won't be any murder, Holton replied coldly. Just a tragic accident. 2 riders ambushed by bandits on the road to Timber Creek. Such a dangerous territory, Montana. Grace felt cold fear grip her heart. Holton intended to kill them both and make it look like a bandit attack. She had to do something. Looking around desperately, her eyes fell on a loose rock about the size of her fist. Carefully, she picked it up. Carter was moving again, trying to circle around to Flynn's position. Grace waited until he was directly across from her hiding place, then threw the rock with all her might. It struck Carter's injured shoulder, causing him to cry out in pain and stumble backward. Flynn used the distraction to his advantage, lunging forward and tackling Carter to the ground. The two men grappled for control of Carter's gun, rolling in the dirt as they fought. Holton spurred his horse forward, aiming his pistol at the struggling men, clearly trying to get a clear shot at Flynn. Without thinking, Grace emerged from her hiding place and ran toward Holton's horse, waving her arms and shouting. The startled animal reared, nearly unseating Holton. He cursed, struggling to control his mount while keeping his gun hand steady. "You little fool!" he snarled at Grace, swinging his pistol toward her. Before he could fire, a shot rang out from the direction of the trees. Holton jerked in the saddle, his pistol falling from his hand as he clutched his arm. Grace whirled to see her father riding into the clearing, rifle in hand. "The next one goes between your eyes, Holton," Jeremiah Albright called out, his voice hard with anger. "Now get off that horse." Behind her, Grace heard a grunt and turned to see Flynn deliver a final punch to Carter's jaw, rendering the man unconscious. Flynn quickly retrieved both his and Carter's weapons, then hurried to Grace's side. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. "I'm fine," she assured him, though her hands were shaking. "But you're bleeding." Flynn touched the cut on his temple and shrugged. "Just a scratch." Jeremiah had dismounted and was approaching Holton, who had slid from his horse and was leaning against a tree, his face pale as he clutched his wounded arm. "You shot me," Holton said incredulously. "You actually shot me." "Be grateful it was just your arm," Jeremiah replied grimly. "What were you thinking, attacking my daughter and Anderson?" "They ruined everything," Holton spat. "My plans for the ranch, for expansion into Timber Creek. Anderson turned you against me, poisoned Grace's mind." "Grace was never yours to begin with," Flynn interrupted, coming to stand beside Jeremiah, "and neither was the ranch." Holton glared at them both. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. I have connections, influence." "And charges waiting for you in Helena," Jeremiah finished for him. "Sheriff Davis told me everything this morning when I was in town. That's why I followed Grace and Flynn when they left. I had a feeling you might try something desperate." Holton's face showed real fear for the first time. "The charges are fabricated. Competitors trying to ruin me." "Save it for the judge," Jeremiah said. He turned to Flynn. "Can you tie these two up? We'll take them back to town for the sheriff to deal with." Flynn nodded, already removing his bandana to bind Carter's wrists. Grace helped him, still shaken but determined to see this through. "I'm sorry," she told Flynn quietly as they worked. "If I hadn't insisted on going to town today." Flynn's gaze softened as he looked at her. "None of this is your fault, Grace. Holton would have made his move eventually. Better now in daylight with your father nearby than catching us unaware." Once both men were secured, they began the ride back to Timber Creek. Jeremiah led the way, with Holton tied to his saddle. Flynn followed with the still groggy Carter similarly restrained. Grace rode beside Flynn, still processing the events of the afternoon. "Thank you," she said softly, "for protecting me." Flynn gave her a wry smile. "From where I stood, you were doing a fair bit of protecting yourself. That rock throw was impressive." Grace felt herself blush. "It was the only thing I could think to do." "It was brave," Flynn said, his voice warm with admiration. "You're quite a woman, Grace Albright." Something in his tone made her heart beat faster. "And you're quite a man, Flynn Anderson." Their eyes met, and in that moment, with the danger past and the future stretching before them, Grace felt something settle in her heart, a certainty she hadn't expected to find so soon. Sheriff Davis was waiting on the steps of his office when they rode into town, alerted by a ranch hand Jeremiah had sent ahead. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion and rumors of trouble. "Well, well," Davis said as they dismounted. "Mr. Holton, seems you've had a busy day." "These people attacked me," Holton protested, wincing as deputies helped him down from the horse. I demand they be arrested. Davis raised an eyebrow. Funny, I've got 3 witnesses who say otherwise, and a telegram from Helena suggesting you're not the most reliable source. He nodded to his deputies. Get them inside and send for the doctor, then lock 'em up. The marshal will be here on Tuesday's stage to escort Mr. Holton back to Helena. As the deputies led Holton and Carter away, the sheriff turned to Grace, Flynn, and Jeremiah. You 3 all right? Anderson, you're bleeding. It's nothing, Flynn insisted, though he accepted the handkerchief Grace pressed to the cut on his temple. What happens now? Now you give me your statements, Davis replied. Then you go home and be thankful this didn't end worse. The process of providing statements took over an hour, with each of them recounting the events in detail. By the time they finished, word had spread throughout town about Holton's attack and subsequent arrest. As they emerged from the sheriff's office, several townspeople approached to express their support. Always knew that city feller was no good, declared Mrs. Peterson from the general store. Grace, you poor dear. What an ordeal. We're fine, thanks to Flynn and my father, Grace assured her. Flynn, is it? Mrs. Peterson's eyes twinkled knowingly. Well, well. Grace felt herself blushing again, but didn't correct the older woman. As they prepared to ride back to the ranch, Pastor Williams approached. I just heard what happened, he said, concern etching his kind face. Grace, my child, are you hurt? No, Pastor, just a bit shaken, she replied. The elderly man looked between Grace and Flynn, noting their closeness and the protective way Flynn stood beside her. Perhaps everything happens for a reason, he said thoughtfully. What was meant to be a wedding day tomorrow has instead become a day of deliverance. Grace hadn't even realized tomorrow would indeed have been her wedding day to Holton. The thought sent a shiver through her. A day of deliverance indeed, she agreed. The ride back to the Albright Ranch was quieter than the journey into town had been that morning. The day's events had left them all reflective, aware of how differently things might have ended. When they reached the ranch, Martha rushed out to meet them, having heard the news from one of the hands who'd gone into town. Grace! Oh, thank the Lord you're safe! She enveloped Grace in a fierce hug before turning to examine Flynn's temple. And you, young man, come inside and let me tend to that cut properly. It's really just a scratch, Flynn protested, but allowed himself to be led into the house. In the kitchen, Martha cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency while Grace and Jeremiah recounted the day's events. That horrible man, Martha muttered as she applied a small bandage to Flynn's temple. To think he might have been master of this house, I shudder to imagine it. Well, he won't be troubling us again, Jeremiah said firmly. The sheriff says the marshal has been building a case against Holton for months. What happened today will only add to his charges. When Martha had finished her ministrations, Flynn stood. I should be getting back to my ranch. It's been a long day for everyone. Nonsense, Martha declared. You'll stay for supper, I insist. Flynn glanced at Jeremiah, who nodded his agreement. You're welcome here, Anderson. More than welcome. Then I'd be honored to stay, Flynn replied. As Martha busied herself with preparing the meal, Grace led Flynn to the parlor where they could speak privately. I want to apologize again for putting you in danger today, she began. Flynn took her hands in his touch gentle. Grace, listen to me. You have nothing to apologize for. If anything, I should thank you. Your quick thinking with that rock probably saved my life. Grace looked down at their joined hands. It's strange. When I saw Carter trying to circle behind you, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was just determined that he wouldn't hurt you. Flynn's fingers tightened around hers. That's how I felt when Holton aimed at you. Like I would do anything to keep you safe. Grace raised her eyes to his, seeing in them a depth of feeling that took her breath away. Flynn? He released one of her hands to gently touch her cheek. I know it's soon, too soon perhaps. But today made me realize life is short and uncertain. I don't want to waste time pretending I don't already know how I feel about you. Grace's heart raced. And how do you feel? I'm falling in love with you, Grace Albright, Flynn said simply. I think I started falling the moment I saw you at that Founders Day dance 3 years ago. Every time I've seen you since has only deepened that feeling. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. I barely know you, she whispered. And yet, somehow I feel like I've known you forever. Flynn smiled, his thumb gently wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. We have time now. Time to get to know each other properly. Time to be sure. And if I'm already sure? Grace asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Flynn's eyes darkened. Then I'm the luckiest man in Montana territory. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Grace responded with a sureness that belied her inexperience, her hands moving to his shoulders as she returned the kiss. It was brief, but perfect a promise of things to come. When they separated, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. I'll court you properly, Grace, for as long as you want. There's no rush. Grace smiled. What if I don't want to wait too long? A slow grin spread across Flynn's face. Then I'll speak to your father when you tell me to, and not a day sooner. Children, supper's ready! Martha's voice broke the moment, and they stepped apart, though Flynn kept hold of Grace's hand. Shall we? He asked, offering his arm. Grace took it with a smile. We shall. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the day that would have been Grace's wedding day. Instead of preparing for a ceremony she dreaded, she found herself riding alongside Flynn toward the church in Timber Creek, her father and Martha following in the wagon. The church was crowded, news of the previous day's events having drawn an even larger congregation than usual. As Grace walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she couldn't help but think how different this might have been under other circumstances. They took their seats in the Albright family's usual pew, with Flynn beside Grace and Martha beside Jeremiah. Pastor Williams began the service with a prayer of thanksgiving for their safety, making oblique reference to the deliverance from unworthy bonds that the community had witnessed. When the service concluded, the congregation filed out, many pausing to speak with Grace and Flynn, expressing relief at their escape from Holton's machinations. Grace was touched by the genuine concern and support from people she'd known her whole life. As they stood in the churchyard, surrounded by well-wishers, Pastor Williams approached them. A word, if I may, he said, drawing Grace and Flynn slightly apart from the others. I couldn't help but notice a certain development between you two. Grace felt herself blush. Pastor Williams, the elderly man held up a hand, smiling. No explanations needed, my dear. I simply wanted to say that sometimes God's plans are not our plans. What seemed a tragedy, your father's arrangement with Holton, has instead led to what appears to be a most promising beginning. He looked at Flynn. You'll take good care of her, I trust? With my life, Flynn promised solemnly. And you, Grace? Your heart is engaged in this courtship? Grace nodded, unable to keep the smile from her face. Yes, Pastor, it is. Then I am content, Williams said, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. May God bless your journey together, wherever it may lead. As they rode back to the Albright Ranch for the Sunday dinner Martha had prepared, Grace felt a profound sense of peace. Just 1 week ago, she had received the telegram that had thrown her life into turmoil. Now, here she was, riding beside a man who respected her, valued her opinion, and was courting her with honorable intentions. The future, which had seemed so bleak just days before, now stretched before her filled with promise. Flynn must have sensed her thoughts, for he reached across the space between their horses to take her hand briefly. Happy? He asked. Grace smiled at him, feeling her heart swell with emotion. Very. And she was. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, Grace Albright was exactly where she wanted to be, with exactly the right person beside her. The months that followed were the happiest of Grace's life. Flynn courted her properly, calling at the Albright Ranch several times a week and escorting her to church every Sunday. They rode together across both properties, picnicked by the creek that marked the boundary between the two ranches, and spent long evenings on the porch swing talking about everything from books to cattle breeding. Jeremiah, seemingly determined to make amends for his near-disastrous arrangement with Holton, embraced Flynn's courtship of his daughter with enthusiasm. The two men often spent hours discussing improvements to the Albright Ranch, with Flynn sharing his knowledge freely and Jeremiah contributing his years of experience. By the time autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek in shades of gold, the Albright Ranch was showing signs of recovery. The irrigation system Flynn had helped implement had saved a significant portion of the summer grass, and the herd was healthier than it had been in years. Word came from Helena that Elias Holton had been convicted of multiple counts of fraud and sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison. Carter, his accomplice, received 2 years for his part in the attack on Flynn and Grace. As winter approached, Flynn's visits to the Albright Ranch grew longer, often extending into the evening as he and Grace sat before the fire in the parlor, talking and planning. Martha watched their growing closeness with approval, while Jeremiah pretended not to notice when their good nights on the porch lasted longer than strictly necessary. On the first snow of December, Flynn arrived at the ranch carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. He found Grace in the barn, checking on a pregnant mare. "She's doing well," Grace told him as he approached. "Father thinks she'll foal in late February." Flynn nodded, leaning against the stall door. "Strong bloodlines. The foal should be exceptional." Grace smiled, wiping her hands on a cloth as she exited the stall. "You didn't ride all the way over here in the snow to discuss horse breeding?" "No," Flynn admitted, his eyes warm as they took in her flushed cheeks and bright eyes. "I didn't." He held out the package. "This is for you." Grace took it, curious. "What's the occasion?" "Open it and see," Flynn replied, a hint of nervousness in his voice that intrigued her. Grace carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a small wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of wildflowers. "It's lovely," she said, running her fingers over the intricate design. "Open the box," Flynn urged softly. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the light from the barn lantern and scattered it in tiny rainbows. Grace's breath caught in her throat. "Flynn?" He took her hands in his expression serious, yet filled with tenderness. "Grace Albright, these past months have been the happiest of my life. I know I promised to court you for as long as you wanted, but I find I can't wait any longer to ask you to be my wife." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Grace, with all my heart. Will you marry me?" Tears of joy filled Grace's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Flynn Anderson, I will marry you." Flynn's face lit with happiness as he took the ring from the box and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "I spoke with your father yesterday," Flynn told her, "asked for his blessing. He gave it without hesitation." "He approves of you," Grace said, admiring the ring on her finger. "As does Martha, as do I, more than I can say." Flynn drew her into his arms. "I love you, Grace. I'll spend every day of our life together making sure you never regret saying yes." "I could never regret it," Grace assured him, reaching up to touch his face. "You're everything I never knew I was looking for." Their kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of the future they would build together. When they finally separated, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. "When?" he asked simply. "Soon," Grace replied without hesitation. "I don't want a long engagement," Flynn smiled. "Christmas? New Year's?" Grace considered. "Valentine's Day, February 14th. It gives us time to prepare, but not too much time." "Valentine's Day it is," Flynn agreed. "I can think of no more fitting date." They announced their engagement that evening at dinner, though from Jeremiah's knowing smile and Martha's lack of surprise, it was clear they had both been expecting it. "About time," Jeremiah said gruffly, though his eyes were suspiciously bright as he shook Flynn's hand. "Welcome to the family, son." Martha hugged them both, tears streaming unabashedly down her cheeks. "Your mother would be so happy," she told Grace. "So very happy." The news spread quickly through Timber Creek. Unlike the whispers that had followed her broken engagement to Holton, the town's reaction to Grace and Flynn's news was universally positive. Pastor Williams was especially pleased, declaring it divine providence that had brought them together. Preparations for the wedding consumed the winter months. Grace and Martha sewed a simple but elegant wedding dress of ivory satin with lace at the collar and cuffs. Flynn and his hands built an addition to the Rockingham ranch house, a bright, airy bedroom with windows facing the mountains and bookshelves built into the walls. "For all those Dickens novels you love," Flynn explained when he showed it to Grace one January afternoon. As February 14th approached, Grace found herself growing more certain with each passing day that she had made the right choice. Flynn was everything Holton was not: kind, honest, hard-working, and deeply respectful of her as a person, not a possession. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow blanketing the landscape in pristine white. Grace stood at her bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. "It's going to be a beautiful day," Martha said, entering with a breakfast tray. "A perfect day for a wedding." Grace turned with a smile. "It already is perfect." Martha set down the tray and moved to help Grace with her hair. "Your mother would be so proud of you today, proud of the woman you've become, and proud of the man you've chosen." "I wish she could be here," Grace said softly. "She is, in her way," Martha assured her, pinning Grace's golden brown hair into an elegant arrangement of curls. "In your strength, your kindness, and your love of this land. She lives on in you, child." The church was filled to capacity by the time Grace arrived with her father. Every resident of Timber Creek, it seemed, had turned out for the wedding, along with ranchers and their families from miles around. Flynn's ranch hands stood along the back wall, having given up their seats to the older town residents. As Jeremiah escorted her down the aisle, Grace saw only Flynn, standing tall and handsome at the altar in a new black suit. His blue eyes never left hers, filled with such love and wonder that it took her breath away. Pastor Williams smiled benevolently at them both as Grace reached the altar and her father placed her hand in Flynn's. "Dearly beloved," the pastor began, his voice carrying to the farthest corner of the packed church, "we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Grace felt a sense of rightness, of perfect certainty, as they spoke their vows. This was meant to be not an arrangement made out of financial necessity, but a union born of mutual respect and deepening love. "I, Flynn James Anderson, take thee, Grace Catherine Albright, to be my wedded wife. I, Grace Catherine Albright, take thee, Flynn James Anderson, to be my wedded husband." When Flynn slipped the gold band alongside her engagement ring and repeated, "With this ring I thee wed," Grace felt tears of joy sliding down her cheeks. "By the authority vested in me," Pastor Williams concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." He smiled broadly. "You may kiss your bride." Flynn's kiss was tender and reverent, yet filled with promise. The church erupted in applause and cheers as they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife. The celebration continued at the Albright Ranch, where tables had been set up in the barn, cleared of hay and decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the occasion. Martha and a committee of church ladies had prepared a feast that would be talked about for years to come. As Flynn led Grace in their first dance, she couldn't help but think of how different this day might have been if she had acquiesced to her father's arrangement with Holton. "Happy thoughts, I hope?" Flynn asked, noticing her reflective expression. "The happiest," Grace assured him. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am. If Father hadn't sent that telegram, if you hadn't offered to help me—" Flynn's arms tightened around her. "I believe we would have found each other anyway. Some things are meant to be." Grace smiled up at him. "I'm beginning to believe that myself." Later, as they prepared to leave for the Rocking A, now their home together, Grace sought out her father for a private moment. "Thank you," she said, embracing him, "for understanding, for accepting Flynn, for wanting my happiness above all." Jeremiah held her close. "I should have considered your happiness from the beginning. Can you forgive an old fool who nearly made the worst mistake of his life? There's nothing to forgive, Grace assured him. Everything worked out exactly as it should. That it did, Jeremiah agreed, looking over her shoulder to where Flynn stood waiting by their horses. He's a good man, Grace, the best. I couldn't have chosen better for you myself. No, Grace agreed with a smile. You couldn't have. As Flynn helped her mount her horse for the ride to their new home, Grace felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had led her here. From that fateful telegram to this perfect day, every step, even the painful ones, had been necessary to bring her to this moment. "Ready, Mrs. Anderson?" Flynn asked, his eyes bright with love and promise as he mounted his own horse beside hers. Grace looked at her husband, her heart full. "Ready, Mr. Anderson, for everything our future holds." And as they rode away together through the snow-covered landscape, cheered on by their friends and family, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she had found exactly where she belonged, not because her father had promised her to anyone, but because she had chosen for herself. She had chosen Flynn, and he had chosen her, and together they would build a life filled with love, respect, and partnership. It was, she reflected, the greatest Valentine's gift of all. 5 years later, Grace stood on the porch of the rocking A, watching as Flynn taught their 3-year-old son, James Jeremiah Anderson, to sit a pony for the first time. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, where their second child, a daughter, she was certain would make her appearance within the month. The past 5 years had brought changes to both the Rocking A and Albright ranches. Under Flynn's management and Jeremiah's experienced guidance, both properties had flourished. The irrigation systems Flynn had implemented had protected them during the drought 2 summers ago, and their combined herds were now among the finest in the territory. But the greatest change had been in their family. Little James had his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. Already he showed a natural affinity for horses and ranch life. Timber Creek had grown as well, with a new schoolhouse where Grace taught 2 days a week, sharing her love of literature with the town's children. The bank that Holton had planned to open was now run by a fair-minded man from Denver who had proven to be an asset to the community. "Mama, look at me!" James called, his small face alight with pride as Flynn led the pony in a circle. "I see you, darling," Grace called back, her heart full of love for her son and his father. "You're doing wonderfully." Flynn looked up at her, his smile as warm and loving as it had been on their wedding day. 5 years of marriage had only deepened their connection, each day bringing new reasons to be grateful for the life they had built together. As Grace watched her husband and son, she thought again of that telegram that had arrived on a spring day 5 years ago. What had seemed like the worst news of her life had ultimately led to her greatest happiness. Her father, now a frequent visitor who doted on his grandson, had remarked just last Sunday that everything had worked out far better than he could have planned. Grace had to agree. Sometimes, the most beautiful endings grew from the most unlikely beginnings. Flynn finished the riding lesson and lifted James from the pony, setting the boy on his shoulders as they approached the house. "I think we have a natural horseman here," Flynn announced, his eyes crinkling with pride as he looked up at their son. "Like his father," Grace replied, reaching up to ruffle James's dark hair. Flynn set James down on the porch and moved to place his hand alongside Grace's on her belly. "How are you feeling?" "Impatient," Grace admitted with a smile. "I'm ready to meet our daughter," Flynn raised an eyebrow. "Still convinced it's a girl?" "Absolutely," Grace replied. "A daughter with your blue eyes and hopefully a better temper than her brother." "Hey!" James protested, though he was already distracted by the barn cat that had appeared around the corner of the house. Flynn laughed, then leaned in to kiss Grace tenderly. "I love you, Mrs. Anderson. More today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." "And I love you," Grace replied, leaning into his embrace. "My heart, my home, my choice." As the setting sun painted the Montana sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Grace Anderson stood surrounded by the family she had chosen and the love she had found. not because her father had promised her to a stranger, but because a cowboy had stood up for her right to decide her own future, and in doing so had won her heart forever.